In the year 1324, a king walked into Cairo with so much gold that he broke the economy. Not hurt it, not shook it, broke it. For 12 years afterward, the price of gold across Egypt and the Mediterranean stayed crushed, because one man, on his way to pray, gave away too much of it. This is not an exaggeration. This is the story of Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, and by some modern estimates, the richest human being who has ever lived, richer, adjusted for the world he lived in, than any oil baron, tech billionaire, or royal family in history. And yet most people have never heard his name. Let's fix that. If you're new here, this channel digs into the moments in history that deserve to be common knowledge, but somehow aren't. If that sounds like your thing, stick around. And there's a subscribe button somewhere near this video that would love a click. To understand Mansa Musa, you have to understand what he inherited. By the early 1300s, the Mali Empire stretched across a huge chunk of West Africa, covering parts of what are now Mali, Senegal, Guinea, Mauritania, and Niger. It was, geographically, one of the largest empires on Earth at the time, bigger than Western Europe. Mali's power came from something simple: location. The empire sat directly on top of the trans-Saharan trade routes, the highways of the medieval world, except instead of trucks, it was camel caravans hauling goods across the desert. And Mali controlled the two things everyone wanted. The first was gold. West Africa held some of the richest gold fields on the planet in regions like Bambouk and Bure. The second was salt, mined out of the Sahara itself, which in a world without refrigeration was almost as valuable as gold, because it was the only way to preserve food. Gold moving north, salt moving south. Mali taxed every ounce that crossed its territory. By the time Mansa Musa took the throne, Mali wasn't some remote kingdom. It was already one of the wealthiest states in the medieval world. He didn't build this empire, he inherited a fortune, and then did something no one expected with it. Here's where the story gets strange. Mansa Musa didn't inherit the throne from his father. He got it because his predecessor, a ruler named Abu Bakr II, allegedly did something almost unthinkable. According to accounts Musa himself gave years later, Abu Bakr II became obsessed with what lay beyond the edge of the known world, specifically what was across the Atlantic Ocean. So he supposedly built a massive fleet, reportedly numbering in the hundreds of ships, loaded them with men, and sailed west into open ocean. He never came back. Not one ship returned. Now, historians today treat this story carefully. It comes to us second-hand through a scholar named Al-Umari who interviewed people who'd spoken with Musa. There's no hard archaeological proof of transatlantic Malian voyages, and the story may have grown in the retelling. But it's a fascinating claim, and it's the reason Mansa Musa ended up on the throne at all. With the previous ruler gone, Musa, then serving as a deputy, was elevated to Mansa, meaning King of Kings or Emperor. Whatever really happened to Abu Bakr II, the throne and the treasury now belonged to Musa. He was about to do something with that treasury that would put Mali on the map, literally. Before we get to the trip that made him famous, it's worth pausing on just how much gold we're talking about. Modern historians estimate that in the 14th century, roughly half of the Old World's gold, meaning Africa, Europe, and Asia combined, passed through West Africa at some point. Mali didn't just have gold, it functioned as one of the primary sources feeding gold into European and Middle Eastern economies. And Musa, as Mansa, had direct access to that supply. Some modern wealth estimates, and these are necessarily rough, since there's no 14th century stock exchange to check, have placed his personal fortune in the hundreds of billions of dollars in today's terms. Some rankings put him at the top of any richest person in history list ever assembled, ahead of Rockefeller, ahead of Carnegie, ahead of every modern billionaire. Numbers like that are almost impossible to picture, so Musa did something that made them impossible to ignore. In 1324, he decided to go on Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, a religious duty for Muslims who are able to make the journey. And he decided to make sure everyone along the way knew exactly who was passing through. Accounts of the caravan Musa assembled for this trip vary, and some of the most famous numbers come from oral tradition and later chroniclers, So take the exact figures as contemporary reports say, not precise records. But even the conservative versions describe something staggering. Estimates from various historical sources range from thousands to tens of thousands of people traveling with him. Soldiers, officials, teachers, family members, and enslaved attendants, a practice common to royal households of the era. Camels carrying supplies. And gold, an enormous amount of gold, some accounts describing over 100 camels loaded with gold dust and bars, distributed among the party specifically to be given away. Because that was the point. Along the entire route, through cities like Cairo, Musa handed out gold. To the poor, to officials, to anyone he met. He funded mosques along the way. He reportedly built a new mosque every single Friday of the journey, wherever the caravan happened to stop. This wasn't random generosity. In Islamic tradition, charity, zakat, is a core religious obligation. Musa was fulfilling it on an imperial scale. But when the caravan reached Cairo, something went wrong. Economically speaking, Musa spent weeks in the city, and he kept giving away gold at a scale the Cairo market had never absorbed before. Gold wasn't just a nice metal back then, it was literally the basis of the local currency system. When you flood a market with that much of a currency's core asset, in a short amount of time, prices don't just wobble, they collapse. The value of gold in Cairo and the surrounding region reportedly dropped so sharply that the local economy took roughly a decade to recover. Some sources say as long as 12 years. Merchants, moneylenders, and the entire trade economy of the city felt the aftershock of one man's pilgrimage stop. Contemporary chroniclers, including the historian Al-Umari, wrote about this directly, that Musa's visit caused gold to lose value throughout Cairo and beyond for years afterward. There's actually a follow-up to this that most versions of the story skip. On his way back home from Mecca, Musa reportedly ran low on funds because he'd given so much away, and had to borrow gold back from Cairo's merchants at high interest just to make it home. The man who broke the gold market had to borrow gold to get home. He gave away a fortune and then had to take out what was essentially a loan to finish the trip. That's either poetic irony or a lesson in budgeting, depending on how you look at it. Here's the thing about that trip. It didn't just cost Musa a fortune. It also made Mali famous, permanently, across an entire continent that had barely known it existed. Word of Musa's wealth spread through the Mediterranean world so thoroughly that in 1375, a Spanish cartographer produced the Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval period, and included a drawing of Mansa Musa himself, seated on a throne in West Africa, holding a gold nugget the size of his fist, wearing a crown, gold scepter in hand. For European mapmakers, Mali went from a blank, unlabeled stretch of the continent to a specifically marked kingdom, ruled by a specifically named, specifically wealthy king. That single pilgrimage did more to put West Africa on European maps than anything before it. He returned home from Mecca with something else too, a renewed focus on scholarship and architecture, and specifically on turning one of his cities into a center of learning that would outlast him by centuries. You've probably heard the phrase, "from here to Timbuktu," usually used to describe somewhere impossibly remote. That reputation is a little unfair to what Timbuktu actually was under Musa's rule, one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. Musa returned from his pilgrimage with scholars, architects, and religious teachers he'd recruited along the way, including, according to tradition, an Andalusian architect and poet named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, credited with helping design new architecture in Mali, including elements of the Jingareba Mosque in Timbuktu, a mud brick structure that still stands today, nearly 700 years later. More importantly, Musa invested heavily in education. Timbuktu became home to the Sankor Madrasa, effectively a university, which alongside other institutions in the city, drew scholars from across the Islamic world. At its height, Timbuktu is believed to have housed enormous private libraries and produced tens of thousands of manuscripts covering law, astronomy, medicine, and theology. Many of these manuscripts still exist today, preserved by families in Timbuktu and now digitized by historical preservation projects. This is a detail that tends to get lost in the richest man alive version of this story. Musa didn't just hoard or spend his wealth, he converted a huge portion of it into institutions, mosques, libraries, and schools that turned Mali into a center of Islamic scholarship recognized across North Africa and the Middle East. Musa died around 1337, and like a lot of empires built around one dominant figure, Mali struggled to hold itself together without him. Succession disputes weakened the central government. Regional governors broke away, and by the mid-1400s, a rising power to the east, the Songhai Empire, began absorbing Mali's territory piece by piece, eventually taking control of Timbuktu itself in 1468. The empire that once controlled half the Old World's gold supply gradually faded from a superpower into a regional state, and then into history books most people never opened. Mansa Musa never set out to be remembered as an economic disaster for Cairo. He set out to fulfill a religious obligation, and he did it in a way that happened to be so extravagant it left a permanent mark on world history. On maps, on economies, and on one of the great libraries of the medieval world. He's a reminder that some of the biggest, wildest stories in human history didn't happen in the places most textbooks point you toward. If you learned something today, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of history, drop a comment with a historical figure you think deserves this treatment next, and I'll see you in the next one.